just see if I can get my glasses on here. Some people know all about Stanford White, and some people have never heard of him. Yeah, I think I really have to do this. I'm sorry. This is impossible. Basically, I can't do this.
Technical difficulties.
Technical difficulty. Thank you. Okay, now we're all straightened out. In 1906, Stanford White, who was at the time the most famous architect in America, was shot dead by a millionaire from Pittsburgh called Harry K. Thaw. He's always referred to as Harry K. Thaw from Pittsburgh. That's a little New Yorkers put down, I think. Who had married a showgirl called Evelyn Nesbit, who had been seduced by Stanford before the marriage, when Evelyn was 16. It's important to know that at that time, architects were major figures, popular figures in American society. They were major celebrities. They were seen as, partly as because they were seen as forming the identity of America as it entered its age of imperial ascendancy in the world. Because of this enormous stature that he had, the murder and the scandalous circumstances surrounding it became a major sort of media scandal event, sort of on the scale of the O.J. Simpson trial, if you eliminate television. It was covered across the country. It said that the Hearst papers rose on the back of the story. There were two trials, much like the O.J. Simpson trial. And a great deal sort of popular feeling that had sort of been latent came to the surface over this resentment at the excesses of the Gilded Age, a feeling of exploitation or of sort of indifference to the cost to the ordinary people of Gilded Age excess. At the time, Stanford was seen as a symbol of that. Actually, in fact, he was the architect of the robber barons of the Gilded Age. He was not himself one of them. He was a working architect. He made a good living as an architect, but was not himself actually a member of the robber baron class. Still, he was in the eyes of the populace that, and because of this, the trial really became a trial of Stanford White. It became a trial of the victim. Harry K. Thaw took the position that in his trial, somewhat, it was sort of a latent position that basically Stanford deserved to be shot. And the reason he deserved to be shot was because it was fairly well known that he had been, that Evelyn was not the only young woman in his life. It was really common knowledge in New York that he was more or less unrestrained in pursuing his sexual appetites, usually with very, very young girls, in fragile economic circumstances. Now, that was understood at the time, and that set the tenor of the trial. But as the century moved on, there was a revision of that, and the revision was that essentially this moralistic judgment of Stanford was just that, moralistic, and reflected a sort of prudish aspect of the times, and in fact that he was a very sexy, glamorous artist who had a great lust for life. And that as that happened, as times became more permissive. And there's some truth in that. But there's also an element of a distortion of the truth, because what got lost as time went on was that the scale of his behavior and the degree to which it had been out of control and destructive to others in his life and to himself. In fact, he died because of it. That became completely obscured, and in fact his relationship with Evelyn became elevated into a romance. And it got instituted as a kind of minor myth in American culture, as a great romance. In fact, I think it was last year, People magazine, for its Valentine's Day issue, chose, great American romances, and it chose Evelyn and Stanford. And so there he was. Now, I grew up in the Stanford White family. He's my great-grandfather. So, and I was born in 1944. So I grew up in a period when he was known principally for this scandal. Beaux-Arts architecture was at that time completely in disrepute, really was torn down as worthless and was regarded as a period best forgotten as modernism sort of rolled forward. So he was not really well known in that period as an architect, but he was known for the scandal, and it had become revised in this way. In fact, there had been a Hollywood movie came out when I was about 9 called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. Now, the family, however, within the family, there was tremendous pain surrounding this figure, this major famous person, this great-grandfather, of whom, on the one hand, I felt very proud, and yet about whom the family was strangely silent and ashamed. And it didn't make any sense, because the family is an artistic family, a sophisticated family. Why would they be ashamed of this character who'd had, well, yes, an affair? But it didn't come together at all. The reason is because, in fact, the original interpretation, though distorted for sure, and though it's absurd that the trial was the trial of the victim, really did reflect the truth, which is that this wasn't a sexy, glamorous situation. This was a situation of men really drastically, seriously out of control in the grips of a kind of compulsion that cannot be in any way viewed as a glamorous thing. And the family had gone through tremendous pain at the time of the trial, of course, this having been exposed, and knew that it was true. I mean, that knowledge was within the family. He was shot in 1906, but my great-grandmother, his wife, lived on well into my lifetime. Till I was 9, I had a very close relationship with her. My grandfather, his son, who was 18 at the time he was shot, lived even further into my lifetime. I grew up on the Stanford White place, where this was all present. So I want to read just a little bit from the beginning that sort of captures a little bit about what I'm trying to do in this book on the personal side. When I was a little girl, I liked to go into a formal garden of box bushes that lay just to the west of my grandparents' house. The box garden, as it was called, was on a terrace that was significantly lower than the house, and thus apart in a zone of its own. The hedges that lined the paths had grown high and billowy, so that they were over my head, and in some places had grown so close together that I had to push my way through. The bushes would then spray me with their gritty dust, and I'd smell the sharp-smelling boxbush decay rising from the damp ground where no sun reached, and see up close the way the leaves were bunched in kernels like tiny loose cabbages. It seems to me now that my family story was all there, always, everywhere, layered away as in the kernels of box, and that I absorbed it somatically, took it in through my pores with the gritty box dust. At the center of the garden was a circular space, also hedged by box, in which there was a shallow round pool with a crouching marble statue of Venus in the middle, her nude back roughened with exposure. The weedy gravel around the pool was also spongy with yew needles, and in one spot there was a bronze flower-shaped lid, light-catching with verdigris, that covered a small well. Removing this cover, I would then reach down till my armpit was crushed against the edge through dampness and maybe bugs, to turn a rusty wheel at the bottom. Then water would spurt from 4 jets around the statue into the sky. Beyond the box garden was the estate that my great-grandfather Stanford White had designed. The place, as we called it in the family. That Stanford was a famous Beaux-Arts architect notorious for being murdered in scandalous circumstances was part of the environment, too. He was, however, rarely mentioned on the place. He was latent. The silence about him was something dark right there in the light. When I was a child, the place was very bright. In that brightness, silence extended to the horizon, like the sea or like his fame. It was everywhere, so that you didn't notice it like the air. There were nodes on the place, a temple in a laurel wood, a statue among pines on a hill, connected either explicitly by roads and pathways or implicitly by the way they were placed in relation to each other. The harmony and symmetry and the balanced interrelation of spots created an atmosphere of providential protection. This rationality and integration is typical of Beaux-Arts design, in which the landscape is an extension of the architecture, and the smallest detail is connected to the vision of the whole. Thus, the silence notwithstanding, there was hardly a spot on the place in which Stanford was not present. That omnipresence extended into other aspects of life. As I grew up and became a writer, I found this whole family matter pressing toward the surface more and more imperiously until I finally felt that I just had to try to write this out. But at the time I started to do that, there were many, many things I didn't understand. I certainly didn't understand the story of Stanford White, what it really was. A reason why that story was so impenetrable to me was, and why the family silence was so absolute, was that the behavior, Stanford's behavior, which had taken place, after all, within a family context, is not usually thought of that way. He's thought of as a single figure, the way famous people usually are. But he also was a member of a family. He was a father and he was a husband. And the behavior, not exactly that kind of behavior, but the dysfunction continued on in the family in slightly other forms, slightly less public forms. But that continued on, a kind of out-of-control, unspoken of sexual predation happened within the family environment and was happening as I grew up, and of course was also not spoken of. So it is that locked in the silence about Stanford. I'm sure that otherwise it would have receded naturally into the past, and certainly at the level of great-grandchild would have been able to view it objectively and apart from myself as just a remote figure in family history. But because there was this connection with what was going on in the present, it remained a highly, highly charged matter. And I took this right into my adulthood, unable to actually find anything out about him, yet always carrying it with me. And I spent my adult life mostly in New York, which is, there's Stanford White buildings all over the place. I uncannily found myself in those environments all the time. I had a job at Random House, which was in the Bullard houses for a while, for example. I lived on Lower Fifth Avenue, which is largely constructed at the Washington Square Arch and the Park and Judson Memorial Church and the interior of the Church of the Ascension, all Stanford White all around me, and I knew that. I knew that latently. So this was a part of my life that was there all along and that came to the surface through writing. It took me a very long time to write this book, and I needed, in order to make a whole out of it and make sense of it, I needed to draw in many different layers of experience. And in fact, I would say that that probably is what I do as a writer, whether it's this memoir biography or whatever, is to relate levels of experience that usually aren't related. The very personal with the historical, with the aesthetic, for example. This book is much about growing up in a family where aesthetics were extremely important, and the connection between aesthetics and emotional life within the family. So it is also, as Donna said, it is about the Gilded Age. So I want to just quickly pick up a few little points of that. I'm sort of really skipping across some vast areas here, so you just have to, if it doesn't quite make sense, just come along with it. The hugeness of Stanford's unspoken of fame on the place reflected unresolved family pain, but it also reflected in preserved form the actual scale of his fame in the time that he lived. He rode a surging national sense of imperial greatness, a mood of power and dominance in the world. His career was merged with the fantasy of the United States triumphant. He subscribed wholly to the idea that the new robber barons, the Whitneys, Goulds, and Villards, who were McKim, Mead, and White's, that's the firm, clients, were the American descendants of the great Renaissance merchant princes, a new upper class that would be the backbone of the imperial nation. It's one of the amazing things about the Gilded Age, how quickly it disappeared into the 20th century, but how at the time they were just absolutely sure that they were at the beginning of a great era which would be dominated by their values. It's very spooky to really look into that and see that, because it vanished so fast, and it was so large and glittering and huge and arrogant. In addition to properly housing our new Medicis, the architects of the time, and perhaps Stanford more than any other, took on the task of teaching them good taste. This mission included helping them buy suitable furnishings and adornments for their palaces. Indeed, Stanford relied for a good portion of his income on dealings in art to fill the houses that he designed. The statue attributed to Michelangelo, recently discovered in the French Embassy in New York, formerly the Whitney Mansion, designed and decorated by Stanford, exemplifies the service he provided his clients in this respect. He had an eye. But with this went a shamelessness about looting Europe of its treasures. He stripped palazzi not only of objects, but of their ceilings, their mosaics, their very door jambs and window frames, paying their impoverished owners the lowest price that he could. Once, when he saw a fountain in an Italian village square, which he wanted for a client, he simply went to the police and made a deal for them to look the other way, while he had the fountain wrenched out and carried off. He was of the opinion that it was the prerogative of an ascendant nation to appropriate the treasures of civilization. Sometimes it confuses people, especially when I read just little passages, why, as his great-granddaughter, I would be reading or writing things that seemed very negative. And that's I have a problem with taking passages out like this, because it does misrepresent me. I mean, I'm very proud of my great-grandfather. I think he was a wonderful architect. In fact, the work of the book was the work of trying to put together into one picture the brightness and the darkness. In fact, whether it's about him or whether it was about my childhood or whether it is about life in general, that the world in which I grew up, a wonderful, beautiful, aesthetic world, was a world which excluded shadow. It excluded the darkness. And that, I believe, is the most devastating and destructive thing. It's not the destructive behavior itself, it's the silence about it. It's not the destructive behavior is bad, but we can recover from almost anything. What is truly destructive is the elimination completely of suffering and darkness, so that you become split off. You no longer are whole. And the work of my book was to try to strive toward a kind of wholeness by linking up the good and the bad. When I do readings like this, it seems like I'm talking only about the bad. Well, I think that more or less uses up our time. I did want to read one more thing. Would that be all right? Now, this is from a completely different type of material. It's about my relationship with my grandmother, not my great-grandmother. This is a book about a large family. It's not just about Stanford. And it's about family life. And if I did my job right, yes, it's true, this is an exotic family with all sorts of special aspects. But if I did the job right, I got deep enough. So it's really a book about family life with which everyone can identify in one way or another, whether or not you have these kinds of glamorous elements in your family life, or whether or not you have these destructive elements. This is Catholicism is a theme in the book, and my relationship with my grandmother is, and beyond that, we don't have time to explain. Throughout the nearly 40 years that our lives overlapped, I encountered Mama, that's what I called my grandmother, far inside her dream of her mother's love. That is where one found her. When I asked myself what in that mirage-ridden world it could have been that she gave me, which was real, which I could carry out, I think of a large, solid jewel. It's as if we had lived inside a complicated, dangerous court run by a despot. That's the silence, the family silence, where all transactions had been stylized to reinforce the despot. And yet, by an ingenious use of those very transactions, we devised a gleaming, faceted, deep-colored, and durable exchange of our own. That was the jewel. It's simple, really. She gave me love and attention. She had it to give by that time. And there's this. When I was in Rome as a child, Rome is a feature of family experience, a special family priest at San Clemente, everything was special in the family, special this, special that, took us down through layers of older San Clementes, each more fragmentary, more obscure, blacker, and more rotten. In the bowels of the earth near the bottom of our descent, we came upon a dimly perceptible Roman arch. That was the earliest church. One could just make out a piece of the line of the arch and get from it a feeling of a larger structure in the dark. But we went still further, down to an iron railing around a pit. There, after a while, we could discern below and across from us a pedimented window, a part of a Roman villa from pagan times, a house. Nor was this all. The surfaces dripped, and in the darkness below was the sound of rushing water. And this. From 3 o'clock on Good Friday afternoon, the time of Christ's death, until noon on Holy Saturday, when Christ rose, all the bells of Rome were silent. In this time also, the door of the tabernacle in every church was left open, and there was no host inside. This emptiness would be existentially brutal in any church in the world. But in Rome, where the bells were integral to daily life, their silence made the absence in the tabernacle not secret inside churches, but as big as the city, as big as the sky. There was a place on the Janiculum, I think, that's a hill in Rome. It was on one of the hills, from which it was said that every bell in Rome could be heard, and on Holy Saturday that year we went there for a picnic. From the hilltop you could see all of Rome with its domes rising out of patchwork of mellow hues in a golden haze. But I was lying on my side, a child, fingering some small wild plants when the bells broke. One clang, a little hoarse, was the leading edge, and then came an explosion. Glory can burst forth from barren grief. The world can break open like a pomegranate. So, I hope that wasn't too big a jump. So would anyone like to ask a question? Yeah.
I'd like to ask something about local architecture, Ms. Lazard. I don't know how familiar you are with Washington, but I was wondering if you could confirm something for me. There's a white building on the east side of DuPont Circle that I've always believed was the work of Stanford White. And if you could confirm that, if you're familiar with it, and if you know of any other buildings in the area that might be his work, because I'd love to see them.
The most famous sort of conspicuous work of his in Washington is Union Station. The problem, I can't answer your question. There has not been a complete inventory made of Stanford White buildings. Part of the reason is because the firm didn't necessarily divide up that way. It is generally true that Stanford would design one building and Charles McKim would design another, but they did overlap. There also are many buildings that the owners attribute to Stanford White, which aren't his at all and weren't even done by McKim, Mead and White. So I do not have a complete inventory. I think I can tell. That's not really. He did the Department of Agriculture, which is pretty much routine Washington neoclassical. So I'm sorry. Yeah.
How did your family react to you writing this book?
Well, it's a large family. I have 36 first cousins. The family really encompassed in here extends out to sort of third cousin level. There are really something like 400, 500 people to be included in that group. But the more inner family of 36 first cousins and 8 siblings above that. It was very difficult, and I don't want to minimize that at all. I think the invasion of privacy issues are very, very serious and very real. I think they've been slighted in the discussion about memoir. We don't really have time to go into that. The family did not react as a monolith. It divided up by generations. My generation being somewhat more open, the in-laws being of my generation being more open than in some ways than my actual cousins. There was a lot of anger about the book. Some people went through it to another place. Others seem to have sort of solidified. I don't know. I hope that's an ongoing process, and I hope that in the long run the book will be a positive element in the life of the family. But I can't know that. Yes?
By writing this book, did you resolve your own psychological concerns about the family?
Well, I did not write the book as therapy, and I don't recommend writing a book like this as therapy. I think it's much better to go to a therapist. And it was, in fact, very important to me that I not use it as therapy, and that, for example, what anger I felt, that I took that elsewhere. I did not want the book to carry anger. I did not want it particularly to be the next stage in the sequence of assault that had gone down through the generation. To publish a book like this, which has very private material in it, is in some ways a violent thing to do. There is inescapably violence in that. And the nature of the sort of assault or the violence or whatever that had been sort of passed down through generations was that it was blind, unacknowledged. No responsibility whatsoever taken for it. And it was really important to me that this book not be a continuation of that, that I take to therapy or wherever what feelings I might have of that nature. I don't know if I succeeded. You can never be sure about that. But of course, it also was for me a very cathartic thing to be able to do, to be able to deconstruct this large environment in which I'd grown up and reinterpret it so that it was consonant with my own experience. It was very important for me to do that. I think that's what writers do, though. They deconstruct the world and re-see it in the ways that we need to see it. I like to see what I did in that context of my work as a writer more than as some sort of personal thing that I needed to do. It did, however, have, it was a very maturing. I matured in the process of doing this. And I released my love for my family in a way. I was able to reach it. They may be very angry at me now, but while I was tied up in a distorted or untrue way of seeing things, one of the things that does is it blocks the channels of love. And that's what constitutes the silence after a while. Yes?
Could you say something about his widow, your great-grandmother, and her life following? Did she remarry, for example?
No, she did not. She lived for, that's a really long time. She died, I think, in 1954, so it's 1906 to 1954. It's really nearly 50 years. She came from a sort of farming gentry kind of family in Long Island that had been there since the 17th century, and she's had very deep roots, sort of humble roots in a certain way that really sustained her, networks of kin, and a profound love of place and association with place. That the family, that's why Long Island was our venue. That's why we were there. It's because of her. She essentially dealt with this with a stiff upper lip, and everyone else fell into line behind that. And it was out of solidarity with her that the silence formed for as long as she lived. No one sort of spoke of it. And the idea in that environment essentially was, what a pity that Judge Smith's, how could God have allowed Judge Smith's, one of Judge Smith's daughters to marry this profligate, embarrassing man. She sort of carried on to the end. You know, as especially a great-grandparent can be a very important person in your life, that you know that the time is limited. and that there's an unconditional acceptance that one gets from a great-grandparent that I got from her. Something very, very loving, and at the same time, I think through my association with her, I sort of took into myself a great deal of the stories. I'm one of the oldest I'm the oldest great-granddaughter, and my sisters, who say I have 5 sisters, a sister 10 years younger, really, this story isn't that important to her at all. I came in on the tail end of this thing, and that's what children do. I think they take it in, and especially children are going to be writers, or maybe that's why they become writers. I don't know which. Yeah.
How did you come up with the title?
Oh gosh, the title was really a difficult thing to do. We arrived at this title, or this was the title. I didn't like this title because it's not true. Stanford White is not the architect of desire, and I hate that when that sloppiness it just goes against everything about my writing. But we liked the title, and I liked the title. I came up with these very sort of hiding titles, like sort of In the Shadow of Venus, or, you know, A Place of Springs, and these sort of, whew. And my publisher, like, I could see her point. So finally I worked it out by, in the last sentence, making it correct. And this is the last sentence. And it's very, very important to me. This history, like all histories, can only be fathomed definitively by the true architect of desire, whose intentions, even in constructing infernal predicaments of the heart of our most tender relations, are, we have to trust, to serve love. So that the true architect of desire is God or nature or whoever it is who's constructed us with these forces in us, and that is the way the title sort of moves into an acceptable zone for me. Yes.
Could you tell me something about the relationship, if there was one, between Stanford White and Henry and Clover Adams?
Oh, Henry and Clover Adams were a little younger. They're sort of in between, just a half generation younger.
I know Stanford White designed the grove for her grave.
Yeah, he did. Henry Adams
Also designed their home. That now
yeah, I think he did. That's right. That's a Washington building by him. Henry Adams, however, was quite contemptuous about Stanford. Yes, because Henry Adams was a terrific snob, and about just about anything. And Stanford was, you know, a kind of a, you know, a noisy, vulgar, conspicuous kind of guy that somebody like Henry Adams might be contemptuous of in certain ways. And Henry Adams thought that the pedestal that Stanford didn't have the profundity, even though he hired him to do it. He had a lot of trouble with Stanford about that, and he felt, I think actually it's quite profound statue, the Rock Creek Park thing, but there was that kind of relationship between them. Yes.
Which part of the family's anger was mostly between female and male?
Which part of the family what?
Anger.
Which part of the...
Yes. Was it mostly for the female side or the male side? Because he had so many females, lovers, whatever, you know. So I just wanted to know from your family if they felt any difference or all the same or what.
If there's a difference between men and women in the family in relation to the family story?
Yes.
Is that sort of
the anger of his life?
Well, the family did not express any anger at Stanford. You know, that there was no anger at him. There was basically the position they took was this trial was all lies. Evelyn Nesbit was a low-class girl who just saw her opportunity with Stanford and was a gold digger, and that's that. I mean, that's the position they took, so that the real hurt and anger was all bottled up. There obviously was tremendous. It deeply affected my grandfather's life. But he went forward in a very traditional sort of WASP way of simply leading an honorable life. He probably was became stuffier than he otherwise would have been. He was sort of extremely respectable, and but a quite wonderful architect. Continued on in the Beaux-Arts style into a period where it became irrelevant. I think that represents an inability to move. Well, I shouldn't make that judgment. That probably may have been just what he needed to do. But the answer is there was no anger that surfaced about this, except perhaps in the silence, unless you can say that silence in some way does express anger. What I felt I did in my book, in some ways, was to bring female experience to the fore in this story, and revise the story in a way that recognizes female experience, whether it's the experience of Evelyn Nesbit, the experience of my great-grandmother, or my own experience within the family. Female experience generally was kind of wiped out, erased, denied.
I painted the sculpture in oil in a big picture because I liked it so much, so I had to paint it.
The Rock Creek sculpture?
Yes.
Yeah, the Clover Adams. It's really interesting that Henry Adams chose Stanford. Henry Adams, whose relation to Clover is so suspect.
The sculpture is not by Stanford White.
No, it's by Augustus St. Gaudens, his very close friend.
That's right.
They were bosom buddies, and
Sculptor and Stanford White?
Yeah.
Somebody's?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and very much Augustus St. Gaudens, wonderful, wonderful sculptor. It's also very much part of the Gilded Age, part of this whole behavior that sort of goes from personal to historical. And it's really fascinating that Henry hired these guys to design the memorial to his wife, who committed suicide under these sort of circumstances that raise questions about Henry's treatment of Clover. And then Henry is contemptuous of these guys. I mean, there's something so fascinatingly ornate there, but that can be unraveled. We know that, right? We know that. We don't have to be daunted by it.
That may help you unravel.
Any more questions? Oh, Susanna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as I said, I encourage you to come on up and get a book signed and talk to Susanna one-on-one. Thank you.
We do. Oh, perfect. Worked out just fine.
I do.
Was your great house in Virginia? That worked like that. I really have.